I'm on the road in Sweden for a few days now, and I crossed different countries to get here. Germany, Denmark, and Sweden itself, of course. And on the road, I didn't really notice that much differences. Maybe the drivers are a bit more relaxed here. But if I had done this road trip a few decades ago, the situation would have been different. Because back then, a totally different traffic system existed in this country. Yeah, believe it or not, I'm talking about left-hand traffic. For many, many decades, Sweden was an absolute exotic in continental Europe, at least when it comes to traffic. Norway and Denmark have always traditionally driven on the right-hand side of the road, as in most European countries. And in Finland, this has been the case since 1858, long before cars became popular. In Sweden, however, people still drove on the left side of the road well into the 1960s, a concept that caused more and more trouble over time and also some bigger problems. Well, and because of all those problems, the Swedish government decided to abolish the left-hand traffic in this country. From one day to another, on the 3rd of September 1967 to be precise, the whole country was switched from left-hand traffic to right-hand traffic, a traffic system that we still know in Sweden today. You know, I have many questions about this. First of all, why was there left-hand traffic in Sweden at all when all the neighbors' countries had right-hand traffic? How do you switch a whole country from left-hand traffic to right-hand traffic? Isn't that super complicated? Well, and if you do, why do you do that? Is right-hand traffic so much better than left-hand traffic, or what's the reason? Well, all of those questions I'm going to answer today. Before we talk about left-hand traffic in Sweden, maybe let's talk about the myth of left-hand traffic in general. So why are there countries on this planet that drive on the left side of the road and others that drive on the right side of the road? Well, those different traffic systems were developed a long time ago, when the car wasn't even invented. The ancient Romans are said to be responsible for this. At least that is what archaeological finds indicate. But which traffic system did they invent back then? In fact, it was left-hand traffic. Researchers assume today that security reasons might have played a role. The Romans probably steered their carts and wagons and horses with their left hand, so they had their right hand free for their weapon in case they were attacked. This traffic system, left-hand traffic, then found its way into medieval Europe. And in 1773, there was also the first real law that made this traffic system the official rule. Of course, in today's #1 left-hand drive country, Great Britain. This decision has its own little story. There was a lot of trading going on in London at the time, and traffic got pretty out of control at some point. A rule was then set for the Thames Bridge. All cars coming from London should then drive on the east side of the bridge, and traffic coming into London should drive on the west side. That was basically the birth of left-hand traffic in the country. In other European countries, people were not so enthusiastic about driving on the left side. Napoleon, for example, was left-handed, and riding on the right side of the road was an intimidating military tactic for him. This in turn had an impact on countries such as Poland, Germany, Switzerland, and Belgium. And right-hand traffic was also preferred in France. Well, and then the obvious thing happened. The British and the French established their traffic systems in their respective colonies. For example, Malta, which was British until 1964, now drives on the left side of the road. The people in Cyprus too. And also in New Zealand and India and in Australia, people still drive on the left side. The rules of Great Britain also influenced transport planning in other countries that were not British colonies. In Japan, for example, the first railway was built in 1872 with the help of the British. And because they only knew left-hand traffic, they also designed the rail network in Japan according to this traffic system. And well, this is still the case today. Today's cars in Japan also drive on the left-hand side of the road. In the French colonies, meanwhile, people tended to drive on the right-hand side, and elsewhere, right-hand traffic developed quite independently of this. In the USA, for example, large wagons were used which were pulled by several horses to transport goods over long distances. The coachman at that time usually sat on the horse on the left and held the whip in his right hand. The car maker Henry Ford, who produced its Model T with a steering wheel on the left, later also had a great influence in the USA. By the way, in all of these decisions, the question of whether driving on the right or left is generally better or worse or more safe or unsafe never really played a role in the age of the car. There is no general answer to this. There are just a few smaller aspects that might play a role. For example, if you drive a car with a manual gearbox, for right-handers, of course, it's more natural to sit on the left side of the car and to shift the gears with the right hand. In Sweden, the rules if you drive on the left side of the road or the right side of the road for many years were a bit complicated because different regions of the country had different laws. In 1718, the whole country tried to switch the traffic to right-hand traffic and to make this the standard, but that didn't really work that well. In 1734, the whole country switched to left-hand traffic, which worked much better, at least until the car was invented. The main problem was that all countries around Sweden had decided to drive on the right. This has always been the case in Denmark and Norway and in Finland since 1858. This, of course, made international trade at the border more difficult. But not only that, the cars that became popular in Sweden were, because they were used all over Scandinavia like that, left-hand drive vehicles, not right-hand drive vehicles like in Great Britain. This made them quite unsafe in Sweden while driving on the left. The consequence, again and again, there were serious accidents, for example when overtaking. And also in the inner cities, the traffic was quite unsafe because of these left-hand drive cars, and it was also often quite confusing for the drivers. Because of all those problems, the Swedish politics discussed for many years to abolish the left-hand traffic and to switch to right-hand traffic like all the European neighbors. But all of those plans over and over again came to nothing. The first suggestion for a change came up in the 1920s. Motor vehicle experts in the country used to be great advocates of right-hand traffic and made this opinion public again and again. In 1930, there was a request for an urgent investigation in the Swedish parliament. However, nothing more happened because the second chamber rejected those plans. Between 1930 and 1939, the subject of right-hand traffic was repeatedly discussed in the Swedish parliament, but always without result. And a planned major investigation in 1940 never was realized because the second legal committee rejected it. Long story short, that's how it went for years, until the 1950s. In 1955, the Swedish government finally decided to hold a referendum. The citizens of the country should simply decide whether they would rather drive on the left or the right side of the road. What followed was a huge uproar in the political debate. Opponents of this rule spread great panic, talking about enormous waste of money or a great bloodbath that would take place on Swedish roads if the country would switch to right-hand traffic. The result? In the referendum, 82.9% of the Swedish people voted against right-hand traffic. And once again, the topic was off the table. This, by the way, also caused international displeasure at that time. Even the Council of Europe got involved and passed a resolution urging Sweden to finally adapt its traffic to neighboring countries. Yeah, but at some point there was no way back anymore. Even though there was this referendum and people didn't really like the change, the Swedish government decided to switch Sweden from left-hand traffic to right-hand traffic in 1963. And that's what happened a few years later. So, the big question now is, how do you actually do this? How do you switch a whole traffic system in a country from one day to another? Isn't that super complicated? Well, turns out there are three things you need. First of all, a good information campaign. Second of all, many volunteers. And third, a lot of money. First of all, 5 groups were set up in Sweden, each with very different tasks. One dealing with road safety, the other with reconstructing roads, traffic signals and so on. And then there were also groups that dealt with financing and traffic law. Together these groups then worked out a plan that looked like this. In the whole country of Sweden, dozens of intersections for right-hand traffic had to be completely rebuilt. 360,000 traffic signs had to be replaced, and of course, the road markings had to be adjusted as well. The biggest problems came up in cities that had one-way streets, which was pretty complicated, and then 8,000 buses had to be either converted or scrapped and bought new. Another challenge, in addition to the reconstruction of the streets, was of course the population itself, because they had to be informed comprehensively about this project. So what happened was, a really huge information campaign was launched. It also had a name, Dagen har, I hope I pronounced that right, which means, translated, day H. The H stands for the Swedish word, and now it gets even more complicated, Högertrafikomläggningen, which means right-hand traffic changeover. More than a year before the changeover, Swedish radio and television were already reporting regularly on day H. In addition, people were also informed outside the media. For example, elderly or disabled people were visited at home to inform them about the changes. Information material was provided to deaf or visually impaired people, including leaflets in all languages of the world. This campaign peaked on September 2nd, 1967, a day before the changeover. All newspapers across the country ran full-page ads announcing Day H. A total of 12 hours of programming was broadcast on television this weekend with only one topic, the switch to right-hand traffic. And on the radio, the changes were announced for 40 hours on 3 channels in 10 languages. Meanwhile, on the streets, the work went into the final round. Here, 20,000 mostly volunteer people worked to replace the traffic signs. Separate signs with the inscription Dagen har were also put up, which indicated that from now on you would have to change lanes. Well, and then it really happened. On the night of September 3rd, 1967, at 1 a.m., all traffic in Sweden was stopped completely. There was a strict driving ban until 6 in the morning. Only a few vehicles were still allowed to drive, such as local public transport or taxis. However, these vehicles also had to stop, more precisely at 4:50 sharp, and then very carefully change to the right-hand side of the road. At 5 a.m. sharp, traffic was allowed to continue, but then on the right-hand side. And since that day, at 5 in the morning, Sweden, like all other neighboring countries, drives on the right-hand side of the road. If you travel Sweden today, you won't even notice anymore that this country used to drive on the left side of the road 56 years ago. But if you have a really close look, you can still find a few relics. In fact, most of the railways in Sweden still run on the left, and the same applies to the subways, for example in Stockholm. At that time there were some trams, for example in Gothenburg or Norrköping, which also changed to the right side with day age. In most other cities, however, the trams were simply abolished completely with the changeover and replaced by buses, for example. The normal railways remained untouched and continued to run on the left side because the driver's seat was on the left side of the locomotives at that time. The signals were usually also on the left side and were therefore easier to see. Changing all of that perhaps would have been a bit too much. Today, only trains around the city of Malmö and further south run on the right-hand side because of their connection to Denmark. Some routes introduced later also are designed for right-hand traffic. But anyway, even though Sweden has been driving on the right side of the road for 56 years now, you see, a little piece of your own traffic history will always remain. Okay, and that was my story how Sweden ditched the left-hand traffic. If you liked this video, if you have learned something, then please leave a thumbs up. You can also hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss any upcoming video. And if you like to support me and my work, you can also do that on Patreon. The link is in the description, and you can become a channel member on my YouTube channel. Then you will also get exclusive stuff and new videos before everyone else, so you should check that out. But that's it for today. Drive safely, have a safe journey, and see you next time.